Sometimes the loneliest person in a crowded room is the one who needs love the most. In Sweetwater Bluff, everyone knows Eleanor Finch sits alone at every dance, the preacher's widow wrapped in grief and shame. The townspeople whisper she's cursed, too proud, or simply forgotten how to smile. But when millionaire cattleman William Creed walks into that dance hall, he sees something different. He passes by all the young beauties and sits right beside the woman everyone else ignores. Eleanor hasn't felt a man's kindness in 2 long years. William lost his wife to fever and understands the weight of sorrow. As the fiddles play and couples spin, these 2 broken hearts find something neither expected. What happens when the richest man in 3 counties chooses the loneliest woman in town? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Eleanor Finch's cottage. Casting long shadows across the worn wooden floors, she swept each day at precisely 7 o'clock. 2 years had passed since she'd become a widow, and routine had become her anchor in a world that seemed determined to drift her toward the rocks of despair. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching the bustling main street of Sweetwater Bluff come alive. The blacksmith was already hammering away at his forge, sending sparks dancing in the early light. Mrs. Henderson hung her washing on the line behind the general store, her movements quick and efficient. Life continued its steady rhythm, but Eleanor felt like a clock that had stopped ticking while the world moved forward without her. On her kitchen table sat the artifact that had defined her existence for the past 24 months, her late husband's worn leather Bible. The pages were dog-eared from years of Reverend Thomas Finch's sermons, and the binding bore the stains of countless cups of coffee during his late-night preparations. Eleanor's fingers traced the cracked leather cover, remembering how Thomas would sit at this very table, crafting words of hope and redemption for his Sunday congregation. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man who preached about forgiveness had left her with a burden of shame that felt impossible to bear. The scandal had broken just 3 months before Thomas's sudden heart attack. Eleanor could still remember the sound of Mrs. Peterson's voice, sharp with righteous indignation, as she'd confronted Thomas after the Sunday service. "Reverend Finch, there's money missing from the church fund, money that was meant for the new roof." Thomas had confessed that very evening, his hands shaking as he told Eleanor about his gambling problem. Late nights at the saloon, playing poker with traveling merchants and cattle drivers. Losses that had mounted until he'd convinced himself that borrowing from the church fund would be temporary, that he could win it back and replace it before anyone noticed. He died before he could make amends, leaving Eleanor to face the congregation's judgment alone. The church board had quietly removed her from her position, organizing charitable works. Invitations to social gatherings had stopped arriving. Even at the mercantile, conversations would halt when she entered, replaced by uncomfortable silence and sideways glances. Eleanor made her way to the front porch, settling into the rocking chair that Thomas had built during their first year of marriage. The wood had weathered to a soft grey, smooth under her hands from countless hours of sitting and thinking. From here, she could observe the town's daily rhythms while remaining safely separate from them. Mrs. Patterson, who owned the small dress shop across the street, was the only person in Sweetwater Bluff who still treated Eleanor with genuine kindness. The elderly seamstress would wave from her shop window each morning, and occasionally she'd cross the street with fresh bread or a pot of soup, claiming she'd made too much for one person. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Patterson had said just last week, settling beside her on the porch steps. "You can't keep hiding from life forever. Thomas made his mistakes, but that doesn't mean you have to pay for them until Judgment Day." But Eleanor knew it wasn't that simple. In a town like Sweetwater Bluff, where everyone knew everyone else's business, redemption came slowly, if at all. The wives of prominent citizens, the banker, the mayor, the wealthy ranchers, had made their position clear through cold shoulders and whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. As Eleanor sat rocking gently in the morning quiet, her attention was caught by a commotion near the train station. A group of men were unloading cattle from the morning freight, and even from her distance, she could see these weren't the scrawny longhorns that usually pass through town. These animals were well-fed and healthy, the kind that spoke of serious money and careful breeding. A tall man in a fine coat supervised the operation, his presence commanding respect from the railroad workers and local hands alike. Even from her porch, Eleanor could sense something different about him, a confidence that came not from bluster or loud talk, but from the quiet assurance of a man who'd earned his place in the world. Word travelled fast in Sweetwater Bluff, and by noon, Eleanor had heard from Mrs. Patterson that the stranger was William Creed, a cattle baron from San Antonio who'd bought the old Morrison ranch outside town. The gossips were already speculating about his reasons for coming to their small community when he could afford to live anywhere he chose. "They say he lost his wife to fever 2 years ago," Mrs. Patterson had confided, lowering her voice even though they were alone in the dress shop. "Hasn't shown interest in remarrying, despite all the eligible ladies throwing themselves at him down in San Antonio. Maybe he's looking for a fresh start, same as anyone might." Eleanor had nodded politely, but inside she felt a strange stirring of recognition. She understood the weight of loss, the way it could drive a person to seek solitude even in the midst of community. Perhaps that explained why he'd chosen to settle in a place where he'd be left alone to heal. That evening, as Eleanor prepared her simple supper of bread and soup, she found herself wondering about William Creed. What drove a wealthy man to abandon city comforts for the dusty simplicity of Sweetwater Bluff? Did he wake each morning with the same hollow feeling she carried, the sense that life was something happening to other people while he merely survived each day? She chided herself for such thoughts. A man of his standing would have his pick of suitable wives, young, beautiful women with unblemished reputations and family connections that would benefit his business interests. The idea that he might understand her isolation was nothing more than wishful thinking from a lonely widow who'd been cut off from society. As darkness settled over the town, Eleanor lit her single oil lamp and sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's Bible. She no longer read the passages that had once brought her comfort. Instead, she simply held the book, remembering the man her husband had been before gambling had consumed him. Thomas had genuinely cared for his congregation, had visited the sick and comforted the grieving with sincere compassion. His fall from grace had been swift and devastating, but it hadn't erased the good he'd done during his years of faithful service. The sound of laughter drifted through her window from the saloon down the street, where the townsfolk gathered to share stories and strengthen the bonds that held their community together. Eleanor had once been part of that warmth, had organized church socials, and helped coordinate relief efforts for families facing hardship. Now she listened from the outside, a ghost haunting the edges of a life she'd once fully inhabited. Tomorrow would bring the same routine, sweeping the floors, tending her small garden, watching life unfold from her porch while remaining carefully separate from it all. But tonight, as she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself thinking about the stranger who'd arrived with his fine cattle and air of quiet authority. Perhaps it was foolish, but she couldn't shake the feeling that William Creed understood something about loss that most people never had to learn. In the distance, the church bell tolled 9 o'clock, its familiar sound echoing across the sleeping town. Eleanor extinguished her lamp and made her way to bed, carrying with her the unexpected hope that tomorrow might hold something different from the careful isolation she'd constructed around her wounded heart. The annual harvest dance was just 3 days away, and for the first time since Thomas's death, Eleanor found herself wondering if she might find the courage to attend. Not to participate, certainly, but perhaps to observe from the shadows, to remind herself what it felt like to be part of the community she'd lost. It was a small thought, barely more than a whisper in her mind, but it was the first step towards something that might, eventually, become hope. 3 days later, the harvest dance transformed Sweetwater Bluff's community hall into a wonderland of flickering lanterns and autumn decorations. Corn stalks bundled with orange ribbon lined the walls, and someone had strung dried maple leaves from the rafters, creating a canopy of gold and crimson above the polished dance floor. The smell of apple cider and fresh bread filled the air, mixing with the sound of fiddles being tuned and the excited chatter of families preparing for their most anticipated social event of the year. Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd, her black mourning dress stark against the colourful fabrics worn by the other women. She'd almost lost her nerve twice on the walk from her cottage, but Mrs. Patterson had appeared at her door just as she was having second thoughts. "Eleanor Finch, you've mourned long enough to honour any husband," the older woman had said firmly, taking her arm. "Thomas wouldn't want you hiding away like a hermit. He'd want you to live." Now, positioned near the refreshment table where she could observe without drawing attention, Eleanor watched the familiar rhythms of small-town celebration unfold. Mayor Thompson welcomed everyone with his usual booming voice. His wife, Mary, beaming beside him, in a dress that had probably cost more than Eleanor spent on food in 3 months. The banker's daughter, Sarah Mitchell, held court near the entrance, surrounded by young men eager for a chance to dance with the prettiest girl in 3 counties. Eleanor recognized most faces in the crowd, people who had once greeted her warmly on Sunday mornings when she'd stood beside Thomas at the church door. Tonight, those same people seemed to look through her, their conversations faltering when she moved too close, their smiles fading when their eyes met hers. "Shameful, really," she overheard Mrs. Henderson whisper to her companion. "A woman her age should know better than to come to a dance dressed like she's attending a funeral. Always was too proud for her own good." "I heard she's behind on rent for that cottage," came the sharp reply from Mrs. Collins, the postmaster's wife. "Maybe if she'd humble herself and ask for help instead of putting on airs, decent folks might consider lending a hand." Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned to endure such comments with the dignity her mother had taught her as a child. "Hold your head high, Eleanor." She could hear her mother's voice across the years. "Your worth isn't determined by what small minds choose to believe." The musicians struck up a lively reel, and couples began forming sets on the dance floor. Eleanor watched young Sarah Mitchell glide across the polished boards in the arms of the bank president's son, her yellow silk dress catching the lamplight like captured sunshine. Once Eleanor had danced at gatherings like this, her hands secure in Thomas's, their movements synchronized by years of partnership and love. She was so lost in memory that she almost missed the sudden quiet that fell over the hall. The fiddles continued playing, but conversation stopped mid-sentence as every head turned toward the entrance. Even the children paused in their games to stare at the tall figure filling the doorway. William Creed stood silhouetted against the night, his broad shoulders outlined by his well-tailored coat. Unlike the other men in their Sunday best, he wore the kind of clothes that spoke of real wealth, fine wool, and expert tailoring that could only be found in big cities. But it wasn't his expensive clothing that commanded attention. It was the quiet authority he carried, the sense that here was a man accustomed to being noticed and respected. Eleanor found herself studying his face as he surveyed the gathering. Strong features, weathered by years spent outdoors, steel-grey hair that spoke of maturity rather than age, and eyes that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing of his own thoughts. When his gaze swept across the room and briefly met hers, she felt an unexpected flutter of recognition, as if something passed between them in that instant of connection. The spell broke as Mayor Thompson hurried forward to welcome the newcomer, his politician's instincts overriding his surprise. "Mr. Creed, what an honor to have you join our little celebration. Please, make yourself at home. Can I introduce you to some of our finest families?" William's response was polite but measured. "Thank you, Mayor. I thought it was time I properly met my neighbors." His voice carried the slight drawl of East Texas, smooth and unhurried. Eleanor watched as he was led through a series of introductions, noting how the unmarried ladies suddenly straightened their postures and smoothed their skirts. Sarah Mitchell abandoned her current dance partner mid-song to position herself in William's path, her mother following close behind with the determined look of a general planning a campaign. "Mr. Creed," Mrs. Mitchell gushed, "you simply must meet my daughter Sarah. She's been looking forward to welcoming you to our community." Sarah curtsied prettily, her practiced smile bright enough to outshine the lanterns. "We're so pleased you've chosen our little town, Mr. Creed. I do hope you'll find the society here agreeable." William nodded politely, but Eleanor noticed his attention seemed to wander as other eligible ladies and their mothers formed a loose circle around him. The banker's wife praised his cattle operation, the mayor's daughter complimented his taste in choosing Sweetwater Bluff, and the blacksmith's niece, who was visiting from Denver, made sure to mention her father's success in mining investments. From her position by the refreshment table, Eleanor observed the social maneuvering with a mixture of amusement and melancholy. Once she had been part of such gatherings, though never as the pursued prize. Thomas's position as preacher had given them respect but not wealth, and Eleanor had been content with their modest place in the community's hierarchy. As the evening progressed, William danced with several of the young ladies, his movements confident despite his unfamiliarity with some of his partners. But Eleanor noticed something in his expression, a politeness that never quite reached his eyes, a courtesy that seemed to cost him effort. When the fiddles paused between songs, she saw him reach into his vest pocket and briefly touch something there, his face growing distant with some private sorrow. It was then that Eleanor recognized the artifact he carried, a silver pocket watch, the kind that often held a photograph or memento. She'd seen Thomas make the same unconscious gesture during their first year of marriage, when he'd carried a daguerreotype of his deceased first wife. The realization struck her with unexpected force. William Creed was as trapped by grief as she was, surrounded by people but fundamentally alone. Their eyes met again across the crowded hall, and this time neither looked away. Eleanor saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch, recognition, understanding, and perhaps a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. The music resumed, a slower waltz this time, and Eleanor watched William politely extract himself from his admirers. To her amazement, he began walking deliberately across the dance floor, his path leading directly toward her corner. Conversations stopped as people realized his destination. The young ladies he'd abandoned looked confused, then offended. Mrs. Mitchell's face flushed red with indignation. William stopped in front of Eleanor, his grey eyes steady and kind. He reached out his hand in invitation, his voice quiet enough that only she could hear. "Mrs. Finch, would you honor me with this dance?" The hall fell silent except for the fiddles. Eleanor felt every gaze upon her, could sense the shock and disapproval radiating from the crowd like heat from a fire. Her first instinct was to refuse, to save them both from the scandal this would create. But something in William's expression stopped her. A understanding that said he knew exactly what he was asking and the cost it might carry for both of them. She placed her hand in his, her voice barely audible. "I would be honored, Mr. Creed." As he led her onto the dance floor, Eleanor heard the sharp intake of breath from the watching crowd, the whispered exclamations of disbelief. But for the first time in 2 years, she didn't care what they thought. In William Creed's careful guidance, in the gentle pressure of his hand at her waist, she felt something she'd thought lost forever. The simple pleasure of being treated with kindness and respect by a good man. The waltz carried them across the floor in perfect harmony. Two people who understood loss, finding an unexpected moment of grace in each other's company. And as they danced, Eleanor dared to hope that perhaps redemption was possible after all. Eleanor woke the morning after the dance, with sunlight streaming through her bedroom window, and the memory of William Creed's gentle waltz still warming her heart. For a brief, precious moment, she lay in bed remembering the feeling of being held with respect, of moving across a dance floor as if she belonged there. Then reality crept back in like cold fog, bringing with it the knowledge that her moment of happiness would come with a price. She dressed carefully in her usual black morning dress, the same severe garment she'd worn every day since Thomas's funeral. Her fingers lingered on the simple gold band that still circled her left ring finger, Thomas's wedding ring, which she'd worn alongside her own since his death. The weight of it had become familiar, a constant reminder of vows taken and promises broken, of love shared and trust betrayed. Eleanor's wedding ring had become more than jewelry in the 2 years since her husband's passing. It was her shield against a world that had already judged her unworthy. As long as she wore it, she could tell herself she was still Thomas's widow, still mourning appropriately, still fulfilling her duty to his memory, despite the scandal that had tainted their final months together. The sound of horses' hooves on the dirt road outside drew her attention to the window. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Collins were riding past in the Hendersons' buggy, their heads bent close together in the kind of urgent conversation that always followed significant social events in Sweetwater Bluff. Eleanor didn't need to hear their words to know she was the subject of their discussion. By the time she'd finished her simple breakfast and prepared for her weekly trip to the mercantile, Eleanor had steeled herself for the inevitable consequences of last night's dance. She walked down Main Street with her chin held high, her marketing basket on her arm, determined to maintain her dignity regardless of what awaited her. The first sign of trouble came at Patterson's dress shop, where Mrs. Patterson usually greeted her with warm smiles and genuine conversation. Today, the elderly seamstress looked troubled as she approached the counter. "Eleanor, dear," Mrs. Patterson said quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I think you should know that there's been considerable talk this morning about you and Mr. Creed." Eleanor set down the ribbon she'd been examining, her stomach tightening. "What kind of talk?" "The usual poisonous gossip, I'm afraid. Mrs. Mitchell is beside herself that he chose to dance with you instead of her precious Sarah. She's been telling anyone who'll listen that you deliberately positioned yourself to entrap a wealthy man, that you're trying to use your widow's weeds to gain sympathy and snare a husband." The words stung, but Eleanor wasn't surprised. She'd expected the gossips to turn their attention on her. What she hadn't anticipated was how deeply their cruelty could still wound her. "And Mrs. Collins," Mrs. Patterson continued, her voice growing sharper with indignation, "has been suggesting that a woman of your circumstances has no business putting herself forward at social gatherings. She's intimating that decent people shouldn't have to endure such displays." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she folded the ribbon and placed it back on the counter. "I see. Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Patterson. I'll be more careful in the future." "Eleanor Finch, don't you dare let those small-minded shrews drive you back into hiding," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "You did nothing wrong by accepting a dance from a gentleman who was kind enough to ask. If they can't see past their own jealousy and spite, that's their failing, not yours." But as Eleanor continued her errands, the weight of the town's disapproval pressed down on her like a physical burden. At the mercantile, conversation stopped when she entered, replaced by meaningful looks and barely concealed whispers. The clerk, who usually chatted pleasantly about the weather, served her in stiff silence, his manner suggesting she'd somehow contaminated his store with her presence. It was outside the bank that Eleanor encountered the cruelest blow of the morning. Sarah Mitchell stood on the wooden sidewalk with 2 of her friends, their bright dresses and elaborate hairstyles marking them as the town's social elite. When Sarah spotted Eleanor approaching, she made no effort to lower her voice. "I simply cannot understand what Mr. Creed was thinking," Sarah declared to her companions. "Dancing with that woman, and in public no less. Perhaps he doesn't understand our community standards, being new and all." "Mama says it was probably pity," replied one of her friends, a plump girl whose father owned the largest general store in the county. "You know how some men get soft-hearted around widows, especially ones who put on such tragic airs." Sarah's laugh was like crystal breaking, Well, I'm sure once Mr. Creed becomes better acquainted with our town, he'll realize his mistake. A man of his standing needs a wife who can do him credit, not some scandalous creature who brings shame wherever she goes. Eleanor walked past them with measured steps, her face carefully composed, despite the fire burning in her cheeks. She'd endured worse in the months following Thomas's exposure, but somehow this morning's cruelty felt sharper, perhaps because last night's brief happiness had left her defenses temporarily lowered. She was so focused on maintaining her composure that she almost missed the sound of a familiar voice calling her name. William Creed sat astride a magnificent bay horse just outside the bank, his appearance as commanding in daylight as it had been in the dance hall's lamplight. "Mrs. Finch," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, "I was hoping I might have a word with you, if you have a moment." Eleanor was acutely aware of Sarah Mitchell and her friends, staring in open shock. Their conversation about William's mistake suddenly rendered embarrassingly public. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and William dismounted with easy grace. "I wanted to thank you for the honor of last night's dance," he said, his voice pitched to carry to their audience. "It's been too long since I've had such pleasant company. I was wondering if you might allow me to call on you this afternoon, if that would be appropriate." The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Eleanor could feel the weight of every gaze on Main Street, could sense the collective intake of breath from the watching townspeople. William Creed wasn't just asking to visit. He was making his intentions publicly known, staking a claim that would be impossible for the gossips to misinterpret. Eleanor looked into his steady grey eyes and saw something that gave her courage, not pity, as Sarah had suggested, but genuine interest and respect. Perhaps it was foolish, perhaps it would only bring more trouble, but in that moment she decided she was tired of living her life according to other people's expectations. "I would be pleased to receive you, Mr. Creed," she replied, her voice clearer than she dared hope. "Shall we say 3 o'clock?" William's smile transformed his entire face, revealing warmth that had been carefully hidden beneath his formal courtesy. 3 o'clock would be perfect, Mrs. Finch. I look forward to our conversation." As he remounted his horse and rode away, Eleanor gathered her courage and walked past Sarah Mitchell's group without acknowledging their shocked stares. Behind her, she could hear the explosion of excited whispers that would fuel Sweetwater Bluff's gossip mill for days to come. But for the first time in 2 years, Eleanor found herself looking forward to something more than simply enduring another day. William Creed had chosen to court controversy by associating with her, and she was determined not to disappoint his confidence. Eleanor spent the hours before William's visit cleaning her small cottage with nervous energy, polishing every surface until it gleamed, and arranging the few wildflowers from her garden in a chipped ceramic vase that had been her mother's. She changed her dress twice before settling on the same black morning gown she'd worn that morning, then chided herself for vanity. What difference could clothing make when her entire reputation was already in tatters? At precisely 3 o'clock, a gentle knock sounded at her front door. Eleanor smoothed her skirts and opened it to find William Creed standing on her porch, hat in hand, a small basket at his feet. He'd traded his formal coat for a simple white shirt and dark vest that somehow made him appear more approachable while maintaining his natural dignity. "Mrs. Finch," he said, offering a slight bow, "thank you for receiving me. I brought a few things from town, Mrs. Patterson mentioned you might appreciate some of the fresh apples that came in on yesterday's freight." Eleanor's eyes widened as she looked into the basket. Along with the promised apples, she saw coffee beans, sugar, a small wheel of cheese, and a tin of tea that must have cost more than she usually spent on groceries in a month. Her first instinct was to refuse such generosity, but something in William's expression stopped her. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Creed. Please come in." She led him into her modest parlor, acutely aware of how small and shabby everything must appear to a man of his means. The furniture was well maintained but clearly old, the curtains faded from years of washing, the rug worn thin in spots from Thomas's pacing when he prepared his sermons. William settled into Thomas's old chair as if he belonged there, his presence somehow making the room feel warmer and more complete than it had in months. "You have a lovely home, Mrs. Finch. There's something peaceful about it." As Eleanor prepared tea, she found herself studying her visitor with curious eyes, in the privacy of her cottage. Away from the public performance of social expectations, William seemed more relaxed, though she noticed the way his hand occasionally drifted to his vest pocket where he kept his silver watch. "You mentioned last night that you understand loss," Eleanor said carefully, as she set the tea service on the small table between them. "I hope I'm not presuming too much by acknowledging what Mrs. Patterson told me about your late wife." William's expression grew distant, his fingers unconsciously finding the watch. "Catherine died 2 years ago, almost to the day. Fever took her in less than a week." He paused, his voice growing softer. "We were married 15 years, and I thought we'd have 15 more at least." Eleanor felt her heart contract with sympathy. "I'm sorry for your loss. 15 years is a blessing many couples never receive, but it's never long enough when you're the one left behind." "No," William agreed. "It's not, and I suspect you understand that better than most people in this town." There was something in his tone that made Eleanor look at him more sharply. "What do you mean?" William set down his teacup and met her gaze directly. "Mrs. Finch, Eleanor, if I may, I've heard the gossip about your husband's troubles before his death. I wanted you to know that such things don't concern me. A man's sins are his own, and they shouldn't be visited on his widow." The simple statement hit Eleanor like a physical blow. For 2 years, she'd carried the burden of Thomas's shame, had accepted the town's judgment as somehow deserved. No one had ever suggested that she might be innocent of her husband's failures. "You're very kind," she managed, her voice unsteady. "But the truth is, I should have known, should have seen the signs. A good wife would have done exactly what you did." William interrupted gently. "You trusted your husband, supported him, believed in him. Those aren't failures, Eleanor. They're virtues that were betrayed, and that's not your fault." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, the first she'd allowed herself to shed in public since Thomas's funeral. On the mantelpiece above the fireplace sat the hand-carved wooden cross that Thomas had made during their courtship, when he was still the earnest young preacher she'd fallen in love with. He'd carved it from oak, spending hours perfecting each detail, and presented it to her on their first Christmas together. "He made that for me when we were newlyweds," Eleanor said, following William's gaze to the cross. "Before the gambling, before the lies. Sometimes I look at it and wonder if I imagined those early years, if the man I thought I married ever really existed." William studied the cross with appreciation. Beautiful craftsmanship. The man who made that had skill and patience, took pride in his work. "That person existed, Eleanor. Weakness and temptation can corrupt good men, but they don't erase the good that came before." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, the afternoon light slanting through the windows and highlighting the dust motes that danced in the air between them. Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced in months, the simple pleasure of conversation with someone who didn't judge her or demand apologies for her husband's sins. "May I ask what brought you to Sweetwater Bluff?" Eleanor ventured. "Mrs. Patterson says you could afford to live anywhere." William's smile was rueful. After Catherine died, San Antonio felt too full of memories. Every street corner, every shop, every social gathering reminded me of what I'd lost. I thought perhaps a smaller community, a simpler life, might help me find some measure of peace. "And have you found it?" "I thought I might be beginning to," William said, his grey eyes warm as they met hers. "Last night was the first time in 2 years that I've felt genuinely at ease in social company. You have a gift for making people feel comfortable, Eleanor. It's a rare quality." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm afraid most people in this town would disagree with that assessment." "Then most people in this town are fools," William said with quiet conviction. A woman who maintains her dignity in the face of unfair judgment, who shows kindness to others despite receiving little in return, that's the mark of true character. As the afternoon wore on, Eleanor found herself sharing stories she hadn't told anyone since Thomas's death. Memories of their early married life, her work with the church's charitable efforts, her dreams of having children that had never been fulfilled. William listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own experiences of building his cattle empire from nothing. When he finally rose to leave, the sun was beginning to set, painting the small parlor in shades of gold and amber. At the door, William turned back to her, his expression serious. "Eleanor, I hope you'll allow me to call on you again. I realize my attention may bring you more difficulty with certain members of the community, and if you'd prefer I stay away." "No," Eleanor said quickly, surprising herself with her vehemence. "Please don't stay away. I haven't felt this hopeful in a very long time." William's smile lit up his entire face. "Then I'll see you again soon. And Eleanor, don't let the gossips steal your light. The town needs more women like you, not fewer." As Eleanor watched him mount his horse and ride away into the gathering dusk, she felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of shame and self-doubt that had lived there for 2 years. Perhaps William was right. Perhaps it was time to stop apologizing for sins that weren't her own. Over the following 2 weeks, William became a regular visitor to Eleanor's cottage, arriving each afternoon with some small gift, fresh bread from the bakery, wildflowers picked from the prairie, or books he thought she might enjoy. Their conversations grew deeper and more personal, covering everything from their shared love of literature to their dreams for the future. It was during one of these visits that William first mentioned his plans for the old Morrison ranch he'd purchased. "I want to build something lasting here," he told Eleanor as they sat on her front porch, watching the sun set over the rolling hills beyond town. Not just a cattle operation, but a real ranch, a place that could support dozens of families, bring prosperity to the whole community. Eleanor leaned forward with interest. "The Morrison place has good water and plenty of grazing land. Thomas used to ride out there sometimes when old Charlie Morrison was still alive. He said it was some of the finest rangeland in this part of Texas." "You know the area well?" William asked, and Eleanor caught something hopeful in his voice. "Well enough. Thomas believed a preacher should know his entire territory, not just the town limits. I rode with him sometimes on his visits to the outlying families." Eleanor smiled at the memory. "I probably know more about the geography around Sweetwater Bluff than most men who've lived here their whole lives." William's eyes lit up with genuine excitement. "Would you consider riding out there with me sometime? I could use the perspective of someone who understands the local conditions, the neighbors, the way things work in this part of the country." The invitation both thrilled and terrified Eleanor. Riding alone with William beyond the town limits would provide even more ammunition for the gossips, but the prospect of being useful again, of contributing something meaningful to a worthwhile project, was too appealing to resist. "I'd be honored to help," she said, then hesitated. "Though I should warn you, it will cause more talk." William reached into his vest and withdrew the silver pocket watch that had become as familiar to Eleanor as her own wedding ring. Instead of checking the time, he opened it with careful reverence, revealing not a clock face, but a small daguerreotype of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "This is Catherine," he said softly, allowing Eleanor to study the image. "She was the most generous person I've ever known, always putting others' needs before her own. But she taught me something important in our last days together." He closed the watch with a soft click. "She made me promise not to live my life according to other people's expectations of how a widower should behave. She said the worst way to honor her memory would be to stop living fully because of what strangers might think." Eleanor felt a profound shift in her understanding of the man beside her. The watch wasn't just a memento of loss, It was a reminder to live with courage and authenticity, to honor the dead by embracing life rather than hiding from it. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Eleanor said gently. "She was, and I think she would have liked you very much." William tucked the watch back into his vest. "So will you ride with me to the ranch tomorrow? I promise to have you back before the gossips have time to work themselves into a proper frenzy." Eleanor laughed, the sound surprising them both. It had been so long since she'd found anything genuinely amusing that she'd almost forgotten what laughter felt like. "Yes, Mr. Creed, I'll ride with you to the ranch." The next morning dawned clear and bright, with the crisp coolness of autumn in the air. William arrived at Eleanor's cottage leading a gentle mare alongside his own mount, both animals saddled and ready for the journey. Eleanor had chosen her most practical dress and her mother's old riding gloves, feeling a flutter of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. As they rode through the outskirts of Sweetwater Bluff, Eleanor was acutely aware of the stares and whispered comments they attracted. Mrs. Henderson actually stopped sweeping her front porch to gape at them, while Mrs. Collins emerged from the post office with her mouth hanging open in shock. But with William beside her, his presence radiating calm confidence, Eleanor found she cared less about their reactions than she'd expected. The Morrison Ranch lay 5 miles southeast of town, accessible by a well-maintained road that wound through rolling grassland dotted with oak groves. As they rode, Eleanor found herself sharing knowledge she'd accumulated during her years as a preacher's wife, which families lived in which homesteads, where the best water sources could be found, which areas flooded during spring rains. "The Hendersons have a small spread about 2 miles north of Morrison's," Eleanor explained, as they crested a low hill. "Good people, but they've struggled since their oldest son was killed in that mining accident last spring. Tom Henderson's getting too old for the heavy work, and his younger boy is barely 16. William made a mental note of the information. "Men like Tom Henderson are exactly who I hope to benefit from this operation. Experienced hands who know the land but need steady work and fair wages." When they reached the ranch itself, Eleanor was impressed by the scope of William's vision. He'd already begun repairs on the main house and barn, and he walked her through his plans for expanding the operation, new corrals, additional outbuildings, and a bunkhouse that could accommodate 12 cowboys. "The key is sustainable growth," William explained as they stood on the ranch house porch, looking out over acres of prime grazing land. "I don't want to strip the land or push the cattle beyond what the range can support. This needs to be an operation that will still be thriving 50 years from now." Eleanor nodded, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. Thomas always said the land would provide for those who respected it, but it would punish those who tried to take more than their share. "Your husband was a wise man in many ways," William said gently. As they explored the property together, Eleanor found herself offering suggestions about everything from the best locations for new wells to the most efficient layout for the cattle pens. William listened to every word with serious attention, asking follow-up questions that showed he valued her input. "You have an excellent grasp of ranch operations for someone who's never run cattle," he observed as they prepared to head back to town. Eleanor felt a flush of pride. "I suppose I absorbed more than I realized during those rides with Thomas. He believed in understanding all aspects of his congregation's lives, including their work." During the ride home, as the afternoon shadows grew longer, William broached a subject that had clearly been on his mind. "Eleanor, I hope you don't think I'm presuming too much, but I'd like to ask your advice about something beyond ranch planning." "Of course," Eleanor replied, curious about what could make the confident William Creed sound uncertain. "I've been invited to attend Sunday service at the church," he said carefully. "Several people have suggested it would help me become better integrated into the community, but I'm concerned about putting you in an awkward position if my presence there causes problems for you." Eleanor considered the question seriously. Attending church with William would essentially announce their courtship to the entire community in the most public way possible. It would also mean returning to the place where she'd suffered her greatest humiliation, sitting in pews where people still whispered about Thomas's downfall. But as they rode through the gathering dusk, with the lights of Sweetwater Bluff beginning to twinkle in the distance, Eleanor realized that her time at the ranch had awakened something in her she'd thought was lost forever, the desire to be part of something larger than her own grief. "Mr. Creed," she said finally, her voice steady with newfound resolve, "I think it's time I returned to church myself. And I can't think of anyone I'd rather sit beside than a man who's shown me such kindness." William's smile was radiant in the fading light. "Then it's settled. Sunday morning, we'll face whatever comes together." Sunday morning arrived with a grey, overcast sky that seemed to mirror Eleanor's nervous mood as she prepared for church. She stood before her small mirror, adjusting the delicate cameo brooch that had belonged to her mother, the only piece of jewelry she owned, besides her wedding ring, that held any real value. The brooch had been a wedding gift from her father to her mother, a symbol of love that had endured through 43 years of marriage until death parted them. Eleanor's fingers traced the intricate carving of the cameo, remembering her mother's words on her wedding day. "This brooch has been worn by women of worth for 3 generations, Eleanor. It doesn't make you valuable, it simply acknowledges the value that was already there." Today, pinning it to her black dress felt like donning armor for battle. She was returning to a place where she'd once belonged, where she'd organized charity drives and taught Sunday school, where Thomas had preached about forgiveness and redemption until his own sins had made those words ring hollow. William arrived precisely at 9:30, offering his arm with the same courtly manner he'd shown since their first dance. As they walked through the streets of Sweetwater Bluff toward the white-steepled church, Eleanor noticed how conversations stopped and curtains twitched as they passed. The news of their courtship had spread through the community like wildfire, and today would be the first public test of how the congregation would receive them. "Are you certain about this?" Eleanor asked quietly as they approached the church steps. "It's not too late to change your mind. I can attend service alone, as I should have been doing all along." William paused, turning to face her fully. "Eleanor, I've spent 2 years learning to live with regret. I won't add to that burden by walking away from something good because other people lack the wisdom to recognize it." The church bells were calling the faithful to worship as they climbed the wooden steps together. Eleanor felt every gaze upon them, heard the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Mitchell as they passed her family's pew, sensed the stiffening postures of the congregation as they made their way down the center aisle. The new preacher, Reverend Daniels, was a young man from Austin who'd been hired to replace Thomas 3 months after his death. He watched their approach with carefully neutral expression, though Eleanor caught the slight hesitation in his movements as he recognized the significance of her return. William guided Eleanor to a pew about halfway down the aisle, not so far back as to suggest shame, but not so far forward as to appear presumptuous. As they settled into their seats, Eleanor was acutely aware of the whispered conversations erupting around them like small fires. "I cannot believe the audacity," came Mrs. Henderson's voice from 2 rows back, pitched just loud enough to be heard. "Parading herself in here like she has every right. And with poor Mr. Creed, who doesn't know what kind of woman he's associating with," added Mrs. Collins in a stage whisper. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes fixed on the cross above the altar, the same cross that had watched over Thomas's sermons about love and compassion. William's hand found hers, offering silent strength and solidarity. The service proceeded with painful tension underlying every prayer and hymn. Eleanor noticed how some congregants pointedly avoided looking in their direction, while others stared with undisguised disapproval. Only a few faces showed anything approaching kindness. Mrs. Patterson nodded encouragingly from across the aisle, and old Mr. Jameson, who'd been one of Thomas's strongest supporters, touched his hat brim in respectful greeting. It was during the offertory, as the collection plates made their way through the pews, that the tension reached its breaking point. Sarah Mitchell, resplendent in a new dress of emerald silk that must have cost more than Eleanor's entire wardrobe, rose gracefully and approached the front of the church. "Reverend Daniels," Sarah said in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the sanctuary, "before we continue, I feel compelled to address a matter that's troubling many faithful members of this congregation." Reverend Daniels looked distinctly uncomfortable, but nodded for her to continue. "We have among us today individuals whose presence raises serious questions about the moral standards of our community," Sarah continued, her gaze directed pointedly at Eleanor. "The Bible teaches us to welcome the repentant sinner, but it also warns against those who would corrupt the innocent through association with scandal." A murmur ran through the congregation, some approving, others shocked by the public confrontation. Eleanor felt William's tension in the rigid set of his shoulders, but his voice remained calm when he spoke. "Miss Mitchell," William said, rising to his feet with quiet dignity, "perhaps you could direct us to the specific scripture that condemns a widow for the sins of her deceased husband." Sarah's composure faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "Mr. Creed, as a newcomer to our community, you may not understand the full circumstances." "I understand them perfectly," William interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "I understand that Mrs. Finch has conducted herself with dignity and grace in the face of undeserved judgment. I understand that she's shown more Christian charity in her isolation than some have shown in their positions of privilege." Eleanor watched the confrontation with a mixture of gratitude and mortification. To have William defend her so publicly was both wonderful and terrible. Wonderful because someone finally stood up for her worth. Terrible because it would likely make him a target of the same social pressure she'd endured. Reverend Daniels cleared his throat nervously. "Perhaps we should focus on worship rather than—" "Of course, Reverend," Sarah said smoothly. But her eyes blazed with fury as she returned to her seat. "I merely thought the congregation deserved to know what standards we're maintaining in God's house." The remainder of the service passed in strained silence. Eleanor barely heard the sermon about forgiveness and second chances, too focused on the waves of disapproval radiating from the pews around them. When the final hymn ended and the congregation began filing out, she noticed how people seemed to give their pew a wide berth, as if moral contamination might be contagious. Outside the church, the social divisions became even more apparent. The prominent families clustered together in tight groups, their conversations hushed, but their gestures indicating heated discussion. Mrs. Patterson made a point of approaching Eleanor with warm greetings, and Mr. Jameson tipped his hat respectfully to both her and William, but they were decidedly in the minority. "Well," William said quietly as they walked away from the church, "that was enlightening." Eleanor felt tears threatening. "I'm so sorry you had to endure that. I should have known Sarah would create a scene. She's been determined to marry wealth since she was old enough to understand what it meant." "You have nothing to apologize for," William said firmly. "Miss Mitchell revealed more about her own character than yours today." As they walked back toward Eleanor's cottage, they were intercepted by Mayor Thompson, his face flushed with the particular discomfort of a politician forced to navigate delicate social waters. "Mr. Creed, Mrs. Finch," the mayor said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief despite the cool morning air. "Quite a stirring service today. I wonder if I might have a word with you both." William's expression remained pleasant but guarded. "Of course, Mayor. The thing is," Thompson continued, glancing around nervously, "there's been some concern among certain prominent citizens about the appropriateness of certain associations. Nothing personal, you understand, but Sweetwater Bluff prides itself on its moral standards." "And what standards would those be?" William asked mildly. "The standard that judges a woman by her husband's failures rather than her own character? Or the standard that condemns kindness between respectable people because it threatens the social ambitions of others?" Mayor Thompson's face grew redder. "Now see here, Mr. Creed, Miss Mitchell is one of our finest young ladies." "Miss Mitchell," William said with steel in his voice, is a young woman who just publicly humiliated a widow in church. If that represents Sweetwater Bluff's finest, perhaps I've misjudged this community's character. The mayor stammered something about misunderstandings and community harmony, but William had already offered Eleanor his arm and begun walking away. As they reached her cottage, Eleanor realized that their public courtship had reached a point of no return. The battle lines were drawn, and whatever happened next would determine not just their personal happiness, but their future in Sweetwater Bluff itself. 3 days after the church confrontation, Eleanor was cleaning out Thomas's old desk when her fingers found something that would change everything she thought she knew about her marriage. Hidden beneath the false bottom of the bottom drawer, a secret compartment she'd never known existed, lay a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon. Eleanor's hands trembled as she recognized the feminine handwriting on the envelopes. These weren't business correspondence or church matters. The letters were addressed to "My dearest Thomas" in flowing script, and they dated from the final year of his life. With growing dread, Eleanor opened the first letter. The words that greeted her made her sink into Thomas's chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Asterisk. My darling Thomas, I cannot bear these stolen moments being all we have. When will you tell Eleanor the truth? I know she suspects something women always do. The church fund money was supposed to give us a fresh start in California, but now everything is so complicated. I never meant for you to sin against God for my sake, but I cannot deny that I love you more than my own salvation. Asterisk. The letter was signed, "Forever yours, Margaret." Eleanor's vision blurred as the truth crashed over her like a cold wave. Thomas's gambling hadn't been an addiction, it had been a cover story, a way to explain the missing church funds without revealing the real reason he'd stolen them. He'd been planning to run away with another woman, to abandon his wife, his congregation, and his calling for a love affair that had been going on under Eleanor's unsuspecting nose. With shaking hands, she opened letter after letter, each one revealing more painful details of the deception. Margaret was married to a traveling merchant who was frequently away on business. She and Thomas had been meeting in secret for over a year, planning their escape to California where they could start over as man and wife. The gambling story had been Thomas's insurance policy. If they were caught, people would think him weak rather than adulterous. One letter, dated just a week before Thomas's death, contained the most devastating revelation of all. Asterisk. Thomas, my beloved, I can wait no longer. My husband returns from Denver next month, and I cannot bear to live this lie any longer. You must choose Eleanor or me. I know she is a good woman, and leaving her will pain you, but we both know our love is greater than the bonds of duty. I will be waiting at the station on Tuesday morning. Please don't let me board that train to California alone. Asterisk. Eleanor realized with horrifying clarity that Thomas had died on the Monday night before that Tuesday morning departure. His heart attack hadn't been brought on by guilt over gambling losses. It had been the result of an impossible choice between his wife and his lover, a choice that death had made for him. The letters painted a picture of a man torn between his genuine affection for Eleanor and a passionate obsession with Margaret. He wrote about Eleanor with respect and fondness, calling her a pearl among women and expressing genuine regret for the pain his choice would cause her. But his words about Margaret burned with a fire that Eleanor now realized had never existed in his feelings for her. Asterisk. My dear Margaret, Eleanor is everything a man should want in a wife, virtuous, intelligent, supportive, but you are everything a man dreams of in a woman, passionate, adventurous, alive in ways that make my blood sing. I have prayed for guidance, but God seems silent on the matter. Perhaps he is allowing me to choose my own path, even if it leads to damnation. Asterisk. The bundle also contained Eleanor's own letters to Thomas during his brief trips to nearby towns, innocent, loving notes from a wife who trusted completely in her husband's devotion. Seeing her own handwriting mixed with Margaret's passionate declarations was like viewing her marriage from the perspective of a stranger. She'd been so naive, so trusting, writing about church social plans and household matters, while Thomas carried on a blazing affair that had consumed his very soul. The final letter was one Thomas had apparently written but never sent, found among his papers after his death, and somehow mixed in with Margaret's correspondence. Eleanor, my dear wife, by the time you read this, I will either be dead or in California with Margaret. I know this betrayal will destroy you, and that knowledge torments me more than the fires of hell ever could. You have been everything good in my life, everything pure and worthy. But Margaret is everything wild and free, everything that calls to the parts of me that were never meant for the pulpit. I do not ask for your forgiveness, for I know such betrayal is beyond pardon. I only ask that you remember the early years of our marriage, when my love for you was uncomplicated by desire for another. Those feelings were real, Eleanor. They simply were not strong enough to overcome what I feel for her. You deserve so much better than a husband who could harbor such deceit. You deserve a man who sees in you everything his heart desires. I am not that man, and I am sorrier for that failure than for any sin I have committed. Asterisk. Eleanor sat in the gathering darkness of her cottage, the letters scattered across Thomas's desk like the fragments of her broken understanding. For 2 years, she'd carried the shame of his gambling, had accepted the town's judgment that she'd failed as a wife by not preventing his downfall. She'd worn guilt like a second skin, believing that a better woman would have seen the signs, would have saved her husband from his weakness. But the truth was so much worse and so much better than she'd imagined. Thomas hadn't fallen prey to gambling addiction, he'd fallen in love with another woman. Eleanor's failure hadn't been in missing the signs of a gambling problem. It had been in not recognizing that her husband's heart belonged elsewhere. Yet in the midst of this devastating revelation came an unexpected gift of freedom. Eleanor had spent months wondering what she could have done differently, how she might have been a better wife, whether her inadequacies had driven Thomas to seek solace in cards and dice. Now she understood that his betrayal had nothing to do with her shortcomings and everything to do with a passion that would have consumed him, regardless of how perfect a wife she'd been. The sound of hoofbeats outside drew Eleanor from her painful reverie. Through the window she could see William dismounting his horse, his face concerned in the lamplight as he approached her door. She'd forgotten that he'd planned to call on her this evening to discuss their strategy for dealing with the growing opposition to their courtship. Eleanor quickly gathered the letters, her mind racing as she realized she now faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could hide this discovery, could continue carrying the burden of Thomas's supposed gambling while pursuing happiness with William. Or she could reveal the truth, exposing not just Thomas's real sins, but also the depths of her own naivety and humiliation. When she opened the door to William's gentle knock, he took one look at her tear-stained face and stepped inside without invitation, his arms encircling her with protective strength. "Eleanor, what's happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor leaned into his embrace, drawing strength from his solid presence. For a moment, she considered fabricating some excuse, some minor worry that would explain her distress without revealing the magnitude of what she'd discovered. But as she looked into William's concerned grey eyes, she realized that any future built on concealment would be as false as her marriage to Thomas had been. "I found something," she said quietly, gesturing toward the scattered letters on the desk. "Something that changes everything I thought I knew about Thomas, about our marriage, about why I've been carrying so much shame." William's expression grew serious as he followed her gaze to the letters. "May I ask what you discovered?" Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood at the edge of a cliff, about to leap into an unknown future. Thomas wasn't a gambling addict, William. He was an adulterer. He stole that church money to run away with his lover, and he died the night before they were supposed to leave together. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Eleanor watched William's face carefully, searching for signs of shock, disgust, or the kind of moral judgment she'd endured from the rest of Sweetwater Bluff. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch, not condemnation, but compassion. "Oh, Eleanor," William said softly, his voice full of understanding rather than horror. "What a terrible burden you've been carrying, and for something that was never your fault to begin with." As Eleanor showed him the letters and explained their contents, she felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of chains she'd worn for so long she'd forgotten they were there. The truth about Thomas's betrayal was painful, but it was also liberating. She was not the failed wife of a gambling addict. She was the betrayed wife of an unfaithful husband, and that distinction made all the difference in the world. In the days following Eleanor's devastating discovery, she found herself experiencing a strange mixture of grief and liberation. The truth about Thomas's betrayal had shattered her illusions, but it had also freed her from the crushing weight of misplaced guilt. For the first time in 2 years, she could look at herself in the mirror without seeing the face of a woman who had failed her husband. William had stayed with her through that first terrible night, sitting beside her as she read portions of the letters aloud, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. He'd listened without judgment as she worked through her feelings: anger at Thomas's deception, humiliation at having been so thoroughly fooled, and a complicated grief for the marriage she now realized had never truly existed. The worst part, Eleanor had confided as they sat by her fireplace in the early hours of morning, is wondering how many people knew, how many pitying looks were really knowing glances. How many times did I defend his character to people who knew the real reason for his behavior? William had reached across the space between their chairs to take her hand. "It doesn't matter what anyone else knew or suspected. What matters is that you lived with integrity and honor. That hasn't changed, Eleanor. If anything, it makes your character shine brighter by contrast." Now, 3 days later, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table with the artifact that would define her next step forward, her grandmother's quilt spread across the entire surface as she examined every intricate stitch. The quilt had been her grandmother's wedding gift to her mother, and later her mother's wedding gift to Eleanor. It was a masterpiece of patience and skill, created from hundreds of small fabric pieces that had once seemed like scraps but had been transformed into something beautiful and enduring. Each block of the quilt told a story: pieces cut from her grandmother's wedding dress, fabric from her grandfather's best shirt, squares from baby clothes worn by children who had grown to adulthood, and scraps from garments worn during both joyous celebrations and times of sorrow. Her grandmother had believed that a life well lived was like a quilt made beautiful, not despite its broken pieces, but because someone had the wisdom and courage to stitch them together into something meaningful. Eleanor traced the intricate patterns with her fingertip, thinking about the conversation she'd had with William the night before. He'd asked her to consider something that both terrified and thrilled her, making their relationship publicly official by accompanying him to the upcoming Cattlemen's Association dinner, where he would be the guest of honor as the newest major rancher in the territory. "It would be a statement," William had said carefully, "not just to Sweetwater Bluff, but to the entire region. You'd be there as my intended, Eleanor. There would be no misunderstanding about my intentions." The invitation represented everything Eleanor had thought lost to her forever: the chance to stand beside a man who valued her, to be part of something larger than her own small existence, to reclaim her place in society not as a widow seeking sympathy, but as a woman worthy of respect and love. But it also meant facing down not just the gossips of Sweetwater Bluff, but the judgment of prominent cattlemen and their wives from across 3 counties. Many of these people would have heard distorted versions of the scandal surrounding Thomas's death, and Eleanor's reputation would be subjected to scrutiny on a much larger stage. Mrs. Patterson had visited that morning, bringing fresh bread and her characteristic blend of practical wisdom and fierce loyalty. "You can't spend the rest of your life hiding from what people might think," the older woman had said as they sat together on Eleanor's front porch. That boy of yours, and don't you dare tell me William Creed isn't the finest man to set foot in this county in 20 years. He's offering you a chance to build something real, something that could last. But the talk, Mrs. Patterson, you've heard what they're saying about me, about us. And now, with what I've learned about Thomas. What you've learned about Thomas changes nothing about you, Mrs. Patterson had interrupted firmly. You were a faithful wife to an unfaithful husband. You maintained your dignity when he was destroying his. You kept his secrets, even when keeping them cost you your place in this community. She'd reached over and patted Eleanor's hand. Child, some people are born to inspire others through their courage. I think you might be one of them. That afternoon, Eleanor had made her decision. She'd removed her black morning dress and spread it carefully in the bottom of her cedar chest, then taken out the deep blue dress she'd worn to her sister's wedding 3 years ago. The dress had hung unworn since Thomas's death, too colourful for a woman in mourning, but perfect for a woman ready to step back into life. The blue fabric was the colour of evening sky just after sunset, rich and dignified, but alive with possibility. As Eleanor held the dress up to herself in the mirror, she saw not the grieving widow who had haunted this cottage for 2 years, but a woman of 35 who still had decades of happiness ahead of her if she was brave enough to claim it. She'd spent the evening altering the dress to fit her slightly changed figure, her grandmother's sewing skills serving her well as she adjusted seams and hemlines. Each stitch felt like a small act of rebellion against the role that had been imposed on her, each modification a step toward becoming the woman she was meant to be, rather than the victim circumstances had made her. William arrived just as Eleanor was finishing her preparations, and the look in his eyes when she opened the door in her blue dress was worth every moment of anxiety she'd endured over her decision. "Eleanor," he breathed, his voice filled with wonder. You look like yourself again." "I feel like myself again," Eleanor replied, and realized it was true. The woman who had loved literature and laughter, who had organized charity drives and welcomed strangers, who had dreamed of making a difference in the world, that woman was still there, had been there all along beneath the layers of grief and shame. As they prepared to leave for the dinner, Eleanor carefully pinned her grandmother's cameo brooch to her dress, not as armor this time, but as a reminder of the strength that flowed through her family's women. She was the granddaughter of pioneers, the daughter of survivors, and she carried their courage in her blood. The Cattlemen's Association dinner was being held at the Grand Hotel in the county seat, a 30-minute ride from Sweetwater Bluff. As their buggy rolled through the countryside, Eleanor felt her nervousness giving way to a quiet determination. Whatever happened tonight, she would face it with her head held high, secure in the knowledge that she had nothing to be ashamed of. "Eleanor," William said as they neared their destination, "I want you to know that regardless of how tonight goes, my feelings for you won't change. You could scandals every person in that hotel, and I would still consider myself the luckiest man in Texas to have earned your affection." Eleanor smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the wool wrap around her shoulders. "And I want you to know, William, that I'm not going to that dinner as your charitable project or your redemption of a fallen woman. I'm going as a woman who knows her own worth, who has something valuable to offer the man she paused, then finished with quiet conviction. "The man she loves." It was the first time either of them had spoken the word aloud, and its power seemed to fill the space between them like starlight. William reached for her hand, bringing it to his lips for a gentle kiss that sealed the promise they were making to each other and to the future they would build together. As the lights of the Grand Hotel came into view, Eleanor straightened her shoulders and prepared to face whatever awaited them. Behind her lay 2 years of grief and shame that were not of her making. Ahead lay the possibility of love, respect, and a place in the world that no one could take from her because it would be built on truth rather than deception. The battle for her happiness was about to begin, and Eleanor Finch was finally ready to fight for it. The Grand Hotel's dining room blazed with the light of 100 candles, their warm glow reflecting off polished silver and crystal glasses filled with the finest wine the territory had to offer. The Cattlemen's Association dinner represented the pinnacle of regional society, where deals worth thousands of dollars were negotiated over cigars and handshakes, where marriages were arranged between powerful families, and where reputations could be made or destroyed with a single whispered conversation. Eleanor felt every gaze in the room turn toward them as William escorted her through the ornately carved doors. The conversations didn't stop. These were people too sophisticated for such obvious displays of curiosity, but she could sense the subtle shift in attention, the way eyes followed their progress across the plush carpet without seeming to stare directly. William had been invited as the guest of honor. The wealthy newcomer, whose investment in the Morrison Ranch represented exactly the kind of capital infusion that could transform the entire region's cattle industry. His introduction to the cattleman's inner circle was supposed to be a celebration of progress and prosperity. Eleanor's presence complicated that narrative in ways that sent ripples through the assembled crowd. The artifact that dominated the dining room was the hotel's magnificent brass bell, mounted prominently above the main entrance, cast in Street Louis, and shipped west at considerable expense. It had been installed to call guests to meals and announce important gatherings. Tonight, it seemed to preside over the evening like a silent judge, its polished surface reflecting the faces of everyone below as they navigated the complex social currents that would determine Eleanor and William's future in this community. Mr. Creed. The booming voice belonged to Colonel Harrison, the largest cattle owner in 3 counties and the unofficial leader of the association. A bear of a man with steel-grey whiskers and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, he approached with his hand extended and a politician's smile firmly in place. "Welcome to our little gathering. We're all eager to hear about your plans for the Morrison spread." Eleanor noticed how the Colonel's greeting included only William, his eyes sliding past her as if she were merely an unfortunate accessory that good manners prevented him from acknowledging directly. It was a masterclass in social snubbing, technically polite, but unmistakably dismissive. William's response was equally masterful in its courtesy and steel. "Colonel Harrison, thank you for the invitation. May I present Mrs. Eleanor Finch, who has been invaluable in helping me understand the local conditions and opportunities." The introduction forced the Colonel to acknowledge Eleanor directly, though his smile became noticeably more strained. "Mrs. Finch, I believe I knew your late husband. Reverend Thomas, wasn't it?" "Yes," Eleanor replied with quiet dignity, offering a slight curtsy that struck exactly the right balance between respect and self-possession. Thomas spoke often of the association's members and their contributions to the community's growth. The Colonel's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise at her composure, then moved on to safer topics. "Well, Mr. Creed, shall I introduce you to some of the other members? I think you'll find we have quite a bit to discuss regarding infrastructure improvements and market strategies." As the evening progressed, Eleanor found herself navigating a complex social minefield. Some wives welcomed her with genuine warmth, curious about the woman who had captured the attention of the territory's most eligible widower. Others maintained a polite but cool distance, clearly having heard unflattering versions of her story. A few, led by Mrs. Morrison, the Colonel's wife, and the undisputed queen of regional society, made their disapproval known through subtle slights and pointed omissions. "Mrs. Creed," Mrs. Morrison said during the soup course, deliberately using the wrong name, "how interesting that you've chosen to emerge from mourning for such a festive occasion. Some widows prefer to maintain their devotion to their late husbands for much longer periods." Eleanor felt William's tension in the way his hand briefly touched hers beneath the table, but she answered with calm grace. "I'm Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Morrison, and I believe my late husband would want me to embrace life rather than retreat from it." Thomas always said that excessive mourning honors the dead less than living fully honors their memory. The response clearly wasn't what Mrs. Morrison had expected, and Eleanor saw several other women at the table exchange thoughtful glances. Perhaps they, too, had wondered about the social expectations that kept widows locked in perpetual grief long after their genuine sorrow had evolved into something more manageable. During the main course, Colonel Harrison stood to address the gathered diners, his voice carrying easily across the large room. The brass bell above seemed to amplify his words as he spoke about progress, cooperation, and the bright future that awaited their region under the guidance of forward-thinking men like William Creed. It's men of vision and capital, like our guest of honor, who will transform this territory from a collection of small ranches into a true cattle empire, the colonel declared, raising his glass in William's direction. We welcome Mr. Creed, not just as a neighbor, but as a partner in building something greater than any of us could achieve alone. The toast was enthusiastic, but Eleanor noticed how it carefully avoided any mention of her or the personal aspects of William's integration into their community. The message was clear. William was welcome as a business partner, but his romantic choices were a separate matter entirely. The evening's turning point came during the dessert course, when William rose from his seat with the quiet confidence of a man who had made his decision and would not be swayed from it. The conversations around the room gradually quieted as people realized he intended to address the gathering, an unusual breach of protocol, since speeches were typically reserved for the association's leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," William began, his voice carrying clearly across the ornate dining room, "Colonel Harrison has graciously welcomed me as a partner in your vision for this region's future. Before we proceed with business discussions, I believe clarity about my personal circumstances would benefit everyone present." Eleanor felt her heart begin to race, uncertain what William intended, but sensing that whatever came next would be irrevocable. Around the room, she could see faces turning toward their table, with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern, to barely concealed anticipation of scandal. William's hand found hers on the table, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture visible to every person in the room. "I want you all to know that Mrs. Eleanor Finch has agreed to become my wife. We will be married next month, and she will be my partner in every aspect of the life I'm building here." The announcement hit the gathering like a thunderclap. Eleanor heard the sharp intake of breath from Mrs. Morrison, saw Colonel Harrison's face flush red above his whiskers, and noticed how several of the younger wives leaned forward with expressions of shocked delight. This wasn't just a social announcement, it was a declaration of war against the forces that had tried to keep Eleanor marginalized. Furthermore, William continued, his voice growing stronger, "I want to address the rumors and gossip that some of you may have heard regarding Mrs. Finch's character. I've had the privilege of coming to know her well, and I can state without reservation that she is a woman of impeccable integrity who has faced undeserved judgment with remarkable grace." Mrs. Morrison could contain herself no longer. Rising from her seat with the imperious bearing of someone accustomed to social supremacy, she fixed William with a stare that could have frozen whiskey. "Mr. Creed, surely you're aware of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding Mrs. Finch's late husband? The scandal," William interrupted with steel in his voice, "was created by a man who betrayed his vows and his calling. Mrs. Finch was as much a victim of that betrayal as anyone else. Yet she has borne the consequences with dignity, while others have chosen to compound her suffering with cruel gossip." Eleanor felt something shift inside her as she listened to William defend her so publicly and so completely. But more than gratitude, she felt a surge of her own strength, her own voice demanding to be heard. She rose gracefully from her seat, the blue dress she wore serving as a visible symbol of her emergence from the shadows of mourning. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor said, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room, I appreciate Mr. Creed's defense, but I believe I should speak for myself. She could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, could sense the collective held breath as the assembled society waited to see what the woman at the center of the controversy would say on her own behalf. For 2 years, I have allowed others to define my worth based on my husband's failures. I accepted judgment and isolation because I believed somehow that his sins were mine to bear. Eleanor's voice grew stronger with each word. But I've recently learned that the truth was even more complicated than any of us knew, and I've decided that I will no longer allow other people's opinions to dictate the boundaries of my life. She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of women who had shunned her, men who had dismissed her, and the few faces that showed support and understanding. I am not asking for your approval of my choices, Eleanor continued. I am simply stating that I intend to live with honor and authenticity, to support the man I love, and to contribute what I can to this community's growth and prosperity. Those of you who can accept that are welcome to our friendship. Those who cannot are certainly entitled to their opinions, but those opinions will no longer influence my decisions. The silence that followed was profound. Then, from the back of the room, came the sound of slow, deliberate applause. Eleanor turned to see Mr. Jameson, the elderly rancher who had shown her kindness at church, rising to his feet with his weathered hands coming together in steady rhythm. "Well said, Mrs. Finch," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his 70 years and his reputation as one of the territory's founding settlers. This region was built by people brave enough to start over, strong enough to face judgment, and wise enough to recognize character when they see it. One by one, others began to join the applause. Not everyone, Mrs. Morrison remained seated with her lips pressed into a thin line, and Colonel Harrison's expression suggested he was reconsidering his business relationship with William. But enough people stood and clapped to make it clear that Eleanor and William would have allies in the battles to come. As the applause finally died away and conversations slowly resumed, Eleanor realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the preacher's widow, hiding from scandal. She was Eleanor Finch, a woman who had claimed her own voice and her own future, and she was finally, truly free. 6 months later, Eleanor stood before the mirror in Mrs. Patterson's dress shop, adjusting the delicate lace sleeves of her wedding gown. The dress was ivory silk rather than white, a choice that acknowledged her status as a widow while still celebrating the joy of new beginnings. Mrs. Patterson had insisted on creating the gown as her wedding gift, working late into many evenings to ensure every detail was perfect. "You look radiant, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, stepping back to admire her handiwork, like a woman who's finally stepped into the life she was meant to live. Eleanor smoothed the silk skirt and smiled at her reflection. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the grief-stricken widow who had sat alone at dances just 7 months ago. This woman's eyes held confidence and peace, her posture spoke of self-assurance earned through trials, and her smile carried the warmth of someone who had learned to value her own worth. On her finger, Eleanor wore a new set of wedding rings, William's choice, crafted by the finest jeweler in San Antonio. The rings were beautiful in their simplicity, 2 bands of gold that represented not the complicated history of her first marriage, but the clear, honest future she and William were building together. Thomas's ring lay in her jewelry box at home, a reminder of lessons learned, but no longer a chain that bound her to the past. The morning had dawned crisp and clear, with autumn colors painting the hills around Sweetwater Bluff in shades of gold and crimson. The church bells were already ringing, calling the community to witness the marriage that had become the most talked-about event in the town's recent history. Eleanor's wedding had become a symbol of something larger than just 2 people finding love. It represented the possibility of redemption, the courage to start over, and the power of standing up for what was right despite social pressure. The guest list told the story of how the community had divided and ultimately begun to heal, some long-time residents choosing to stay home in protest, others attending with genuine joy, and many more coming out of curiosity about the woman who had defied their expectations. As Eleanor made her way from the dress shop to the church, accompanied by Mrs. Patterson and two other ladies who had become genuine friends during the months of preparation, she noticed how different the streets felt from those dark days when she'd walked them in isolation. Children waved from windows, shopkeepers called out good wishes, and even some faces that had once turned away now offered tentative smiles. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the weeks following the cattleman's dinner, there had been more confrontations, more gossip, more attempts to pressure William into reconsidering his choice. Sarah Mitchell had made one last dramatic appeal, appearing at his ranch with tears and declarations that Eleanor had somehow bewitched him. Mrs. Morrison had organized a petition suggesting that William's business ventures might not be welcome if he insisted on forcing unsuitable associations on decent society. But for every voice raised against them, another had spoken in support. Mr. Jameson had made good on his applause at the dinner, publicly praising Eleanor's character and William's wisdom in recognizing it. The Henderson family, whose financial struggles Eleanor had quietly helped ease through William's employment offers, had become vocal advocates for her kindness and generosity. Even Reverend Daniels had eventually come around, delivering a sermon about forgiveness, second chances, and the danger of casting stones when one's own house might be made of glass. The church looked magnificent as Eleanor approached its white-painted doors. William had arranged for flowers to be brought from San Antonio, roses and lilies that filled the sanctuary with color and fragrance. The pews were full, representing not just Sweetwater Bluff, but families from across the county who had come to witness this unusual love story reach its conclusion. As Eleanor walked down the aisle on Mrs. Patterson's arm, the older woman having volunteered to stand in place of Eleanor's deceased father, she saw faces that told the complete story of her journey. There was Colonel Harrison, who had ultimately decided that William's business acumen mattered more than his choice of bride. There was Mrs. Henderson, whose opinion had softened considerably after Eleanor had helped nurse her youngest through a difficult illness. There were the wives from the cattleman's dinner, some still coolly disapproving but present nonetheless, others having been won over by Eleanor's grace and William's obvious devotion. And there, at the altar, stood William in his finest suit, his grey eyes warm with love and pride as he watched her approach. Beside him stood Mr. Jameson as his best man, the old rancher beaming with the satisfaction of someone who had recognized character when others had been blinded by prejudice. The ceremony itself was simple but deeply moving. Reverend Daniels spoke about the courage required to love after loss, the wisdom needed to see past surface appearances to the heart beneath, and the blessing that came to communities wise enough to embrace second chances. When William and Eleanor exchanged vows, promising to support each other through whatever trials might come, there wasn't a dry eye in the sanctuary. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Eleanor caught sight of a familiar face near the back of the church. Margaret Wheeler, for that had been Thomas's lover's name, sat quietly in the last pew, her own wedding ring catching the light as she applauded with the rest of the congregation. She had returned to Sweetwater Bluff the previous month with her merchant husband, and in a conversation that had been both painful and healing, she and Eleanor had made their peace with the past. "I never meant for Thomas to hurt you," Margaret had said during their private meeting. "I was selfish and foolish, but I never wanted an innocent woman to suffer for my sins." Eleanor had found forgiveness easier than she'd expected, perhaps because carrying anger required energy she preferred to spend on building her future with William. The reception was held at the newly completed community hall that William had helped fund as his first major contribution to Sweetwater Bluff's growth. As Eleanor danced with her new husband while the fiddles played the same waltz they'd shared at the harvest dance, She marveled at how completely her life had transformed. "Any regrets, Mrs. Creed?" William murmured as they swayed together. Eleanor looked around the hall, filled with people celebrating their happiness. Some who had supported them from the beginning, others who had come around gradually, and a few who were still learning to accept change. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the grief that had nearly broken her, the shame that hadn't been hers to carry, the courage that had finally allowed her to claim her own worth. "Not a single one," she said, meaning it completely. Sometimes the loneliest person in a crowded room really is the one who needs love the most. But sometimes, if she's very lucky, love finds her anyway. As the music played and the autumn light slanted through the windows, Eleanor Creed danced with her husband and looked forward to a future built on truth, respect, and the kind of love that saw past surface judgments to the heart beneath. She had learned that redemption was possible, that second chances were real, and that sometimes the best chapters of life were written after the worst ones had ended.